Did you know any people during the Great Depression that were better off than you were significantly?
Yes, there were a lot of people that were a lot better off than we were. Uh, People that had farms that were productive. One of my classmates in school was the daughter of a dairy farmer right at the edge of town, and they did very well. At least they seemed to. People who had regular jobs. My uncle, who was a judge, did very well. Was on was a government employee. Another girl in my class at the time was a daughter of a railroad employee, and he worked for the railroad. They lived right beside the railroad depot, and she always seemed to be better off than I was. And there was one year a kid showed up in class that was different from anybody else. All of us in Kansas wore overalls, that is denim bib overalls, to school. And here this kid shows up with knickerbockers in corduroy, that is corduroy pants that came down just below the knee and were had elastic, and stockings that came up to where the knickers ended. And nobody had seen anything like that. And it happened that he lived right across the street from my aunt, and I was staying with my aunt that year. And we became friends. We'd play together. There was a park right behind where my aunt's house was, and we'd play in the park, and we climbed up on the garage, my aunt's garage, and jumped off one day, and his little brother that was with us wouldn't jump, and so we had to go and get help getting him down, and my aunt was a little bit disturbed at that. They were certainly better off than anybody else we knew. His father drove a big shiny Cadillac or Lincoln or something of that sort, and had given his son instructions that his friends were not to be invited into the house. Well, Otto Nordman was his name, snuck me into his house one day, and I remember very distinctly seeing this huge picture on the wall with two flags crossed above it. I didn't know who the guy was at the time, but later discovered that it was Adolf Hitler. And the flags were the Nazi flags. I didn't know at the time, and didn't learn until after the war had started, that his father was a Nazi spy. He was spying out the oil reserves of the United States in central part of the country, in Kansas and Oklahoma. His mother had gone to Ladies' Aid Society meetings with my mother, and there had been quite a controversy when she had said that, but Hitler is a wonderful man. And my mother and a number of others didn't believe it. And they were not at all surprised to discover later that this guy was a Nazi spy. And of course they were doing very well, because the Nazis were confiscating all the money of the Jews in Europe and living off of all that ill-gotten wealth.
What were some of your experiences with dust storms and farming, living near the Dust Bowl area in the 1930s?
Well, that's a very vivid memory to me. It's hard for people to understand that it was so dry in the central states that the wind would blow and the dust would just be caught up in the wind, and you could actually tell which way the wind was coming from by the color of the sky. If it was from Colorado, the sky would be reddish. The dust from Colorado was red. The dust from Oklahoma would be kind of gray, and the dust from Nebraska to the north of us would be black. it would roll in huge clouds, and uh, the sun would be darkened. It would be like night. In fact, the chickens would go to roost in the middle of the day when these dust storms would come and the sky would get so dark the chickens thought it was night. And then after a dust storm had passed, sometimes they'd last a day, sometimes longer, sometimes even less, I suppose. But the dust would filter in the tiniest holes and cracks and crevices in the walls and under the door and around the windows, and leave piles of dust all over everything. And it wasn't just enough to sweep it out. The next day you'd have to get a shovel and scoop the dust and clean your house out. That was quite memorable. And the locusts or grasshoppers would be so thick that they would eat everything, the crops in the fields, the corn, and the onions. I remember looking at a place where there had been onions in the garden, and the grasshoppers had eaten the onion right down into the ground and left this hole in the ground where the onion had been. It's just hard to imagine how devastating both the drought and the depression and the plagues of locusts and grasshoppers was.
Did you or your family ever have to take jobs due to the Depression, which you would otherwise not have taken?
Well, I was too young to have a job. I was 9 when we finally left Kansas. But my mother, who was a teacher and had worked as a teacher in public schools, couldn't get a job as a teacher. And I remember one time she got a job cleaning houses for 15 cents a day. She spent the whole day cleaning other people's houses for 15 cents. That's how scarce money was, and how much a few cents would buy. Money was just so scarce, and nobody had any money to do anything. In fact, it encouraged a barter economy, as I mentioned, I think. People didn't have money, so they would exchange things. I remember one time one of the drugstores downtown offered ice cream cones in exchange for eggs. And I think maybe it was a half a dozen eggs or so you could get an ice cream cone. And so a couple of my friends and I went downtown. We had eggs from the chickens we had, and we took these eggs and gave the eggs to the clerk in the drugstore, and he dipped out 2 huge scoops of ice cream on an ice cream cone. And I think that was the only ice cream cone I'd ever had in the Depression. We didn't have money for that sort of thing. One of my cousins, who was about 10 years older than I was, had a job in the creamery. And I remember one time he brought home, I think maybe it was a gallon of chocolate malted milkshake, and passed it around to everybody, and that was a real treat. I'd never tasted anything quite as good as that in all my life. But of course nobody could buy anything like that. If you worked in the creamery, you could bring something like that home. And we and his family and my sister and I and my cousin and his sister really savored that chocolate malted milkshake.
What significant changes, either for the better or for the worse, did the Depression have in your life?
I suppose the most significant change is that it made a lifelong Democrat of me. My family, my parents grew up Republican and were convinced that the Democrats had the best ideas for running the country. They remained Democrats to the day they died. The Depression also gave me a great deal of unease about the economy and about prices, and I've never been willing to go into debt if I could help it, although I went into debt to buy a house and a car and that sort of thing, but I would never borrow anything that I didn't absolutely have to. And that was conditioning that the Depression left with me. Uh, when you've seen people starving and seen people lose their farms, their houses, because they had a mortgage they couldn't pay for, it leads you to a very deep respect for the need to pay as you go. And I've never been willing to go into debt because I've seen what can happen in a depression when people don't have money to pay for things they've committed to, such as a mortgage or taking a loan on their farm to buy crop seeds and that sort of thing. So I've been very reluctant to borrow, probably to my disadvantage. I think if I'd invested more in the stock market today, I would have more savings. But the stock market crash of 1929 and the Depression scared me away from investments in the stock market, although I do have money in mutual funds, but somebody else manages the stock purchases and sales for those funds. I've been reluctant to play the stock market myself, although younger people than me have gotten into it and have done very well. I just hope that the economist isn't right that there is a depression just around the corner.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Dr. Kendall. We appreciate you spending some time to answer these questions.